Your silence says what your words never could. Carl Jung observed that the psyche often protects its most important contents by refusing to hand them over to language at all, keeping them instead in a wordless country where they can finish becoming what they are. There is a line Jung wrote in a letter to a young woman named Fanny Bowditch in 1916, and it has stayed with me for years, he wrote. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, before we go further, because most of us have it backwards. We think the outward gesture, the explanation, the text message, the long overdue conversation, is the mature thing, the responsible thing, and that the quiet is the failure, the avoidance, the thing we should feel guilty about. But Jung would stop you right there and say, do you see it? The one who is dreaming is the one performing his inner life outward for others to witness and confirm, and the one who is awake is the one who has stopped needing that confirmation, who has gone inside to find out what is actually there before handing any of it out the door. Your silence may not be the unfinished sentence you think it is. It may be the very evidence that you have started looking in the right direction. So here is a short and honest reflection to carry into what follows. I say inwardly, there are things in me that have never found the right words, and I no longer treat that as a failure. There are people who misread my quiet as coldness, and I am learning that their reading is not the whole truth of me. There is a life going on beneath my silence that is mine to tend before it is anyone else's to witness. And I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of thinking is good company for you, consider staying close by subscribing, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the same quiet way this one did. If something in what I have just said made you go still inside, a small still that felt more true than uncomfortable, type the words, "face it," in the comments. Just those 2 words. Let them be your own private acknowledgement. No one else has to know what they mean to you. The first key is, what you keep silent is not always what you cannot say. Sometimes it is what you have decided, quietly and without ever framing it as a decision, not to spend. Think of the difference between a man who cannot speak and a man who will not. The first is wounded, the second is guarding something. And most of us who go quiet in the moments that matter are the second kind, far more often than we admit. You sat across from someone this week, maybe at a dinner table, maybe in a car with the radio low, and there was a true sentence sitting right behind your teeth, and you felt it rise, and you let it go back down, and afterward, you told yourself you simply did not know how to say it. But Jung would ask you to look again, because sometimes the sentence was perfectly formed, and what stopped you was not a lack of words, but a private calculation that this particular truth was not for that particular room. That is not cowardice. That is a kind of psychological economy. The psyche deciding where its contents are safe to spend and where they would only be misspent, wasted on ears that could not hold their weight. Think of it the way a careful person thinks of money. Not every coin needs to be spent the moment it is earned. Some of it is set aside on purpose. And a silence you are keeping on purpose is closer to savings than to debt. Imagine a woman sitting in a Tuesday morning meeting with an idea for how her team could work differently. She has thought it through on her commute. She has the sentence ready, and then the meeting moves on, and she says nothing. And driving home, she tells herself she is too timid, too slow to speak up. But ask her honestly, and she will admit something closer to the truth. She watched the room for a moment first. She felt that this idea, spoken there, to those particular people, in that particular tone of the day, would be picked apart before it had a chance to be understood. So she held it, not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of custodianship, waiting for a room that could actually receive it. That is not weakness. That is the psyche protecting something it already knows is worth more than a quick airing. This is close to what Jung meant when he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Notice, he did not say the inability was always a wound. Sometimes it is simply an accurate reading of the room, The mistake is not the silence. The mistake is believing that every silence is the same silence. Some are empty, some are full, and the fullness does not announce itself. It is not a failure of language. It is a decision your deeper self made before your conscious mind caught up to it. And that decision opens into a stranger question. If part of you is choosing what to withhold, what exactly is it protecting? I do not withhold to hide, I withhold to keep something whole. The second key is, the tongue moves faster than the truth, and often betrays the very thing it means to protect. Here is what I mean by that. Notice how often the words that come out fastest, most fluently, most confidently, are not the deepest ones but the polished ones, the ones you have said before, the explanations you keep in your pocket for exactly this kind of moment, and notice how the actual weight in you, the thing underneath, tends to arrive clumsy if it arrives at all, stammering, incomplete, easily talked yourself out of. This is why a fluent apology can feel hollow, while a silence before an apology can feel like the realest thing in the room. The fluent version came from the persona. That negotiated mask, Jung described as that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. The persona is very good at producing words. It was built for exactly that, presenting a coherent face to the outside world. But the deeper material, the shadow material, the grief, the shame, the tenderness you were taught early to keep hidden, none of that was built for public performance. It does not come out polished, and so very often it does not come out at all. It waits. Think about how this plays out in an ordinary week. On Monday, you answer a co-worker's question about your weekend with a smooth little story. 3 sentences, a laugh at the end, no hesitation anywhere in it, because that story is persona material, rehearsed, safe, handed over 100 times before, but on Thursday night your partner asks a single quiet question, "How are you really doing?" And something in your chest seizes. The words that come are broken, half sentences. You start twice and abandon both attempts, and you feel almost embarrassed by how badly you are doing at something as simple as talking. But notice what actually happened there. The co-worker got fluency, because the co-worker was getting persona. Your partner got static, because your partner was reaching toward shadow. The clumsiness was not a worse performance, it was a truer one. We have been trained since childhood to treat smoothness as sincerity and stumbling as failure, when very often it runs the other way entirely. The smooth answer is the one that cost you nothing because it never touched anything real. The stumbling answer is the one that cost you something because it was dragging real weight up from underneath. Think also of the text message you draft and redraft for 20 minutes before sending to someone you have hurt, and how each version gets a little more polished, a little more articulate, a little further from what actually happened inside you the night it occurred. By the 5th draft, you have written something impressive and almost entirely persona, while the first draft, clumsy and unsent, sitting deleted in your notes app, was closer to the truth than anything you actually delivered. Imagine a woman standing at her father's hospital bed, and every sentence she rehearsed on the drive over evaporates the moment she is actually standing there, and what is left is just her hand on the blanket and her eyes wet and nothing said. From the outside that might look like failure, like she came all this way and could not manage the words, but Jung would say something different happened there. The persona ran out of material, because this was not a persona moment. This was a shadow moment, an anima moment, something too close to the core of her to be handed over in the fluent voice she uses at work. The silence was not empty. It was the only honest thing available to her in that instant. And here is the harder question this key opens. If your fluent words are often persona, and your true silence is often shadow, then what have you been mistaking for honesty all these years? I trust the silence more than the performance. The third key is, every psyche carries at least one locked room, and the lock on that door is not shame the way we usually imagine shame. It is timing. Jung kept his own locked room for most of a lifetime. In the first chapter of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he tells the story of the small carved mannequin he made as a boy, a little wooden figure, no taller than a finger, dressed in a tiny coat he sewed himself, and he hid it, in a forbidden attic space, along with a smooth black stone from the river, and he would climb up there in secret and sit with it. And he wrote that this ritual gave him a feeling of great security, a sense that something in him finally had a safe place to exist, and he said plainly that he told no one about it for decades, not his mother, not a single friend, not even in his student years, when he had every vocabulary he needed to explain it. And he did not stay silent out of fear of punishment. He was long past the age of childish punishment when he finally spoke of it in his old age. He stayed silent because the secret had a protective function. It kept something whole while it was still forming. And he understood, looking back as an old man writing his memoir, that had he told anyone too early, a parent, a teacher, even a kind and patient friend, the thing would have lost its reality the moment it left him. It would have become a story about a strange boy with a doll instead of what it actually was, a private communion with something in himself for which he did not yet have language and did not need to too. This is the part people miss when they hear the word secret and immediately reach for the word guilt. Some secrets are not hiding a wrongdoing, they are incubating a becoming, and there is a difference between a locked room built to conceal something rotten and a locked room built to let something unripe finish ripening in the dark. A jar of wine sealed in a cellar is not being punished, it is being given the conditions it needs. Open it too soon, and you do not get wine faster, you get vinegar. And something similar happens to the tender contents of the psyche when they are handed out into the light before their season. Think of your own life for a moment. Is there a hope for how you want the next chapter to go that you have kept entirely to yourself, not because you are ashamed of it, but because you sense, correctly, that saying it out loud too soon would let other people's doubt get inside it before it has hardened into its own shape? Imagine a woman in her late 30s who has quietly begun applying to a different kind of work altogether, something she has wanted for years, and she tells no one, not her husband, not her sister, not her closest friend from college. And when she is finally asked, months later, why the secrecy, she says, because if I had told you in the beginning, and you had raised even one eyebrow, I am not sure the idea would have survived long enough to become real. That woman is not being dishonest with the people she loves. She is protecting a fragile new growth from a wind it cannot yet withstand. And Jung would recognize exactly what she is doing, because he did the same thing with his mannequin, and later in life he would do it again, with entire seasons of his own inner work that he did not publish until he judged them ready, sometimes decades after he first lived them. So the locked room is not always a wound room, sometimes it is a nursery, and the honest work is learning to notice which door you are actually standing in front of, because the two doors can look identical from the outside, both quiet, both closed, both giving nothing away. And the question this opens is uncomfortable and worth sitting with, rather than answering too fast. If some silence is protective incubation, how do you tell the difference between the silence that is helping something grow and the silence that is simply hiding from a truth you are afraid to face? My quiet is sometimes a nursery, and I will learn to know which the fourth key is. You have very likely been mistaking someone else's silence for rejection, when what you were actually meeting was their own locked room, their own mannequin, in their own attic. This is the turn I want to make now, because up to this point, we have been talking about your silence. And now I want to ask about the silences that have hurt you, the parent who never explained why they left, the partner who goes quiet exactly when you need them to speak, the friend whose face closes like a door the moment a certain subject comes up. You have felt that silence as a wall built against you personally. You have told yourself the story. They do not trust me enough. They do not think I can handle it. They are punishing me. And sometimes that story is true, but very often it is not the whole story. Jung would remind you here of something he said about projection, that we discover in our neighbor whatever it is we are most sensitive to in ourselves. And the same mechanism runs quietly through how we interpret other people's silence. We fill their unspoken space with our own oldest fear, the fear of being unworthy of the words, so their silence becomes proof of something about you, when it may have almost nothing to do with you at all. Imagine a son who spent 30 years believing his father's silence about the war he served in was a silence aimed at him, a withholding, a closed door with his name on it. And only near the end of his father's life did he learn, almost by accident, that his father had never told anyone, not his wife, not his own brother, that the silence was not a wall built against the son specifically. It was simply the only room the father had ever had for that material, too raw, too early, never quite finding its words even after 50 years. The son had spent decades taking personally something that was never about him. This does not mean you should stop asking for what you need from the people close to you. It means you might hold their silence a little more loosely, not automatically reading it as a verdict on your worth. And here is where the key opens further. If their silence is often their own locked room, rather than a judgment on you, what has your reflexive hurt been costing you? And what might it cost you still? I will not read their silence as my sentence. Subscribing now means tomorrow's teaching arrives before the noise of the day gets to you first. And that quiet is worth protecting. So if this has been good company, stay close. The fifth key is, silence has two faces, one that isolates you and one that ripens you. And learning to tell them apart is close to the whole work of becoming yourself. This is the deepest one. So let me walk through it slowly, in pieces, the way it actually reveals itself. First, consider the isolating silence. This is the one Jung was pointing to when he wrote of loneliness as the inability to communicate what seems important to oneself. This silence does not protect anything. It simply seals you off. You know the feel of it. It is the silence after you have tried 3 times to explain something and watched the listener's eyes glaze, or worse, watched them nod in the wrong places, and you learned, correctly or not, that this particular truth has no home out there, so you stopped offering it, and over months and years, that stopping calcifies into a habit, and the habit becomes a wall, and eventually you are standing fully surrounded by people, at a birthday dinner, in a crowded office, in your own living room with someone you love, and you are utterly alone inside it, because the thing that matters most to you has nowhere left to go. This is a cost. Jung never romanticized this kind of isolation. He lived through periods of it himself. He wrote candidly of how difficult it was even for him, a man whose whole profession was understanding the inner life of others, to find anyone who could really follow him into his own depths. This silence is not noble simply because it is quiet. It is a genuine loss, and it deserves to be named honestly as a loss, rather than dressed up as strength. Second, consider the ripening silence. This is a different animal wearing the same coat. This silence does not come from being unable to find a listener. It comes from sensing, with real accuracy, that the thing inside you is not yet finished becoming itself, and that speaking it now would freeze it in an unfinished shape. The boy with the mannequin in the attic was living this kind of silence, not because no one would have listened, his mother might well have listened, but because the telling itself would have changed the thing being told. This silence is closer to what Jung, much later in his life, called in a letter to a friend named Hans Schmaltz, a fount of healing. He was in his 80s when he wrote that, explaining to an old friend, gently, why he was declining an invitation to visit. He said solitude was for him a source of renewal rather than a wound, and he was not describing withdrawal from life. He had a family around him. He had visitors. He had correspondence with people across the world. He was describing a specific kind of chosen quiet that let him keep working on what mattered to him, without narrating every stage of it for an audience. Third, and this is the hard part, these two silences can feel identical from the inside. That is the trap. Both involve not speaking. Both can involve a tightness in the chest when someone asks you what is wrong. Both can look, from across the room, exactly the same. So how do you actually tell them apart? Here is a rough and honest way to test it. Ask yourself, does this silence feel like a held breath or a planted seed? A held breath silence has a strain to it, a pressure building behind the sternum, a sense that you are managing something rather than tending it, that if the dam broke, you would not know what would come out, and there is often a bitterness underneath it, a quiet resentment at everyone who is not asking the right questions. A planted seed silence, by contrast, has a strange calm to it. Even when the material inside is painful, there is no pressure to release it, only a patience, a sense that this is simply not the season yet, and there is very little resentment in it, because you are not blaming anyone for not extracting it from you. You are simply not ready to hand it over. Imagine two women, both quiet about the end of the same kind of marriage. One of them goes silent at dinner parties and later cries alone in her car in the parking lot, furious that no one asked how she was really doing. That is a held breath. The other goes quiet in a different register, writing in a private journal she shows no one, taking long walks, feeling something in her slowly reorganizing itself. And when she is finally ready to speak of it, months later, the words come easily, almost calmly, because the material had time to finish forming. That is a planted seed. Fourth, and this is where the key turns fully toward you. Most of us are carrying both kinds at once. In different rooms of the same life, you may have a planted seed silence about your own unfolding work, your own quiet study, your own private hope, and in the very same week, a held breath silence about something painful with someone you love that has gone unspoken for so long it has started to poison the water around it. The task Jung would set you is not to eliminate silence. That would be its own kind of violence against yourself. The task is to sort your silences honestly. Which ones are nurseries, and which ones are wounds pretending to be nurseries, because speaking feels too frightening. This sorting cannot be done in a single sitting. It takes the same patient attention Jung asked people to bring to their dreams, noticing without forcing. And here is a small practice worth trying this week. Take a moment, quiet, undisturbed, and bring to mind one thing you have been keeping silent. Just one, and ask it plainly. Held breath or planted seed. Do not answer too quickly. Sit with the discomfort of not knowing right away, because the answer that arrives slowly is almost always more honest than the one that arrives fast. And once you know which kind it is, you will know something you did not know an hour before, whether this silence is asking to be tended a while longer, or whether it has quietly become a wall you built and then forgot you were the one who built it. I will not mistake every silence for the same silence. The sixth key is, your silence, rightly held, can become a kind of fidelity to yourself rather than a failure toward anyone else. I want to leave you with this because it is easy, after everything we have just walked through, to come away suspicious of your own quiet, treating every silence as something to interrogate and diagnose. That was never the aim. Jung was no hermit, and he never taught that withdrawal from the world was the mark of depth. He had a wife, children, a wide circle of colleagues, decades of correspondence. What he taught was something more modest and more useful. That not every true thing is owed to every listener. That some parts of you are allowed to exist without a witness for a while. That this is not a defect to be corrected, but a feature of how a soul actually grows. Think of it the way you would think of a photograph still developing in the dark. There was a time before instant images when a print had to sit untouched in darkness for its proper interval. And if you opened the door too soon out of impatience or anxiety, you did not get to see the picture faster. You ruined it entirely. Some of what you carry in silence right now is still in that darkroom, and the patience you are extending toward it is not avoidance, it is craft. Imagine a man who keeps a small garden on the side of his house. Nothing grand. A few rows of vegetables he tends alone before anyone else in the house is awake. No one asks him about it, and he does not offer. And one morning, his grown daughter finds him kneeling in the dirt and asks, almost teasing, why he never talks about this. And he says, because talking about it was never the point of it. The point was the doing. And he goes on kneeling there, and something in her softens, because she realizes she has spent years measuring her own inner life by whether it gets narrated out loud, whether it gets witnessed, applauded, understood, and watching her father, she begins to see that a thing can be entirely real, entirely his, without ever becoming a story told to someone else. That is the same fidelity I mean, your quiet study, your private grief, your slow-forming hope. None of it needs an audience to be true. It only needs your own attention. Return to it faithfully, the way water is returned to a garden, whether or not anyone is watching it grow. So this week, when you feel that old guilt rise, the sense that you should have said something, explained yourself, filled the quiet, pause first and ask which kind of silence you are actually in. And if it is the planted seed kind, let it be, without apology. Tend it the way you would tend anything you actually cared about keeping alive. And if it is the held breath kind, you do not need to release it all at once to the whole world. You might simply choose one trustworthy person and one small piece of the truth. That is enough to start. Not the whole confession, just the first honest sentence. Your silence has already said more than your words could. It has been saying it in the kneeling, in the walking, in the long private hours no one else has seen. And it may go on saying it a while longer yet. And that is not a failure of speech. That is a life still being lived faithfully on the inside before it is ever handed outward. I let my silence be honest rather than empty. Here is the whole picture. What you keep silent is sometimes a decision rather than a failure. The fluent words are often persona, while the true silence is often shadow. Every psyche keeps a locked room, and the lock is timing rather than shame. Other people's silence is usually their own locked room and not your verdict. Silence itself splits into the held breath that isolates and the planted seed that ripens. And the whole task was never to end your silence, but to learn its two faces so you can tend the one and gently loosen the other. These were never 6 separate keys. They were 6 turns of the same single key. The recognition that your inner life does not owe the world a running commentary in order to be real. That some of the truest things about you have been growing quietly this whole time, unwitnessed and no less true for it. And that the work now is simply to know your own silence well enough to trust it. I make the unconscious conscious. Once more, I make the unconscious conscious. And if your silence has been saying something your words never quite managed, what do you think it has been trying, patiently, all this time, to tell you?